Hi there, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome to Left Side of the Aisle. I'm your host, my name is Larry Erickson, and I'm going to be your ranter and raconteur for about the next close to half an hour, talking about things that I think are important enough for you to take note of. If you have any comments, questions, reactions, whatever to the show, you can email them to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Or you can go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and it'll be down here somewhere a couple times during the show. You can go there, you can get my email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. I do ask, if you do send me email, to please include something in the subject line to make it clear this is not spam, of which I get way too much like the rest of us, and be a little patient about getting an answer because I'm terrible about answering email. All right, with all that out of the way, let's get to it. I always like to start where I can with a bit of good news, so let's do that. Almost a year ago, I almost gave the Clown Award to the folks involved in this business called rolling coal. This is a practice which one person actually pointedly and quite accurately referred to as pollution porn for dudes with pickup trucks. Simply put, what's happening is that some truck owners are spending anywhere from $500 to $5,000 to rip the air pollution controls out of their trucks and install switches that trick the engine into thinking it needs more fuel, diesel fuel, than it actually does. The result is the fuel is incompletely burned and the excess is spewed out as copious amounts of black soot. This is being done, apparently, as a matter of social and political protest against all things perceived of as liberal, including hybrid cars, and all things Obama. One of these folks said the attitude is that if Obama is into the environment, then we're not. And so the trucks become a way of giving the finger to concern about the environment, which to me seemed really, really stupid and certainly deserving of the award. But then it occurred to me that these people are spending hundreds and even thousands of dollars to make their trucks less fuel efficient, which costs them even more money. Which I said, this doesn't even rise to the level of stupidity. This is moronic. So on that occasion, I gave the Clown Award to somebody else. But the reason I bring this up is that people were still doing this. People were still getting their cash-wasting, air-fouling kicks out of dumping a load of soot on anybody or anything they perceived of as liberal. It's still moronic, but it's also polluting, and it's dangerous because these clouds of smoke can obstruct the view of the drivers who are being hit with them. Well, last year, one of these nincompoops made the mistake of doing this to a car owned by a New Jersey state assemblyman. Now, less than a year later, rolling coal is illegal in New Jersey. It also apparently is already illegal under federal law, according to the EPA, but the reality is that this is the type of thing much more likely to be enforced at a state or local level than it ever is at the federal level. So New Jersey having done this, and apparently Illinois now considering doing it, yeah, that's good news. All right, on something else that's maybe a little more serious as good news, but still good news. On May 13th, the Vatican formally recognized the state of Palestine by finalizing a new treaty concerning activities of the Catholic Church in the Palestinian territory. Now, this wasn't, or at least it should not have been, a surprise, since it was merely the formalization of a state of affairs that has existed for some time. In fact, back in 2012, a majority of the General Assembly of the United Nations voted to recognize Palestine as a non-member state. At the time, the Vatican said it welcomed this decision, which actually gave Palestine the same legal status at the United Nations that the Vatican itself has. Now, in the years since, the Vatican has referred to Palestine as a state in its official yearbook, and the Vatican's been referring unofficially to the state of Palestine for at least a year, including a reference by Pope Francis during a 2014 visit to the West Bank. So the treaty has really just formalized what had already existed. Vatican spokesman, Reverend Federico Lombardi, said of the agreement, yes, it's a recognition that a state exists, but added that, quoting, "We have recognized the state of Palestine ever since it was given recognition by the United Nations in 2012. Some 136 nations now recognize Palestine as a state. The Vatican is the third European nation to do so, following Iceland in 2011 and Sweden in 2014. Now, several other European countries, specifically including France, Spain, and the UK, have expressed support for Palestinian statehood, but none of them have actually, recognized it officially. Not surprisingly, the Israeli foreign minister said it was disappointed by this development, saying, quote, "This move does not promote the peace process." Because, after all, what promotes the peace process is whatever Israel wants. And if you have any doubts about that, just ask the U.S. Congress. The U.S. and Israel insists that a state of Palestine will be born of peace talks in the region, not through declarations that the state exists. Yet, just like the state of Israel was born through careful and lengthy negotiations with the Arab nations. The thing is, what we have seen here in this latest action by the Vatican is we've seen the Catholic Church embracing reality, which itself is a pretty interesting concept, and surely is good news. By the way, speaking of the Vatican, there's two recent cases where Pope Francis has made more news. On May 10th, in response to a question from a group of children he was addressing, he said, and I'm quoting, "Many powerful people don't want peace because they live off war. Some powerful people make their living with the production of arms, which he called the industry of death." The next day, in his homily during a Mass, Francis said the planet apparently has enough food to feed everybody, but, quote, "It seems there is a lack of willingness to share it with everyone." Again, quoting him, "We must do what we can so that everyone has something to eat, but we must also remind the powerful of the earth that God will call them to judgment one day, and there it will be revealed if they really tried to provide food for him and every person, and if they did what they could to preserve the environment so it could produce this food." Meanwhile, a papal document addressing climate change is expected next month. Pope Francis has already said that he is convinced that such climate change is, quoting him, mostly man-made. One of the Pope's key advisors, Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Madaringa, said he was stunned by the complaints that he had heard during a recent trip to the United States about, he said, a papal document that hasn't even been released yet. He accused those of fueling this notion, of fueling these complaints. He accused those of fueling an ideology, quote, "that is very strongly linked to a vision of capitalism that doesn't want to renounce damaging the environment for the sake of profits." After a recent visit with the Pope, Raul Castro said he was so impressed with the Pope that he may rejoin the Catholic Church. And if Francis keeps up like this, you can understand why. All right, from there we go to an RIP. The thrill is gone. One of the all-time great blues guitarists, the king of the blues, B.B. King, has died in his home in Las Vegas at 89. It was the end of a more than 65-year career that redefined the blues. B.B. King was an inspiration and a mentor to an enormous number of guitarists of my generation, including people like Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, Jimi Hendrix, Otis Rush, Buddy Guy, John Mayall, Keith Richards, and more. The thing is, when B.B. King played a guitar, he wasn't playing a guitar. He was pulling emotion out of a guitar. He was pulling the emotions out of the songs. He was pulling the emotions of the songs out of the strings, while the notes pinged and sang and ran and cried. And he kept doing it. He kept performing, sometimes more than 250 shows in a single year, almost until the very end. But perhaps the real measure of the man is the fact that when the news story said, as I said at the beginning, that he died at his home in Las Vegas, that wasn't entirely true. Born Riley B. King in 1925 in rural Mississippi, he spent his youth in the small town of Indianola, Mississippi, and still considered that home. Still considered it home, a home where he is known by the residents as Mr. Riley, the residents he came to visit and play for every year. One music critic said that when you met the man, he was less Mr. King than he was your Uncle BB. He was noted for never singing and playing at the same time. He would sing a verse and then have his guitar sing the verse back to him. Supposedly, he once told an interviewer that the reason he did that is because he had discovered that he could not play and sing at the same time. He couldn't do both at the same time, so he figured, I'm just going to do one and then the other. He always called his guitar Lucille. And there are several versions of the story as to why. This is the one I heard him tell himself. He said that early in his career, he was working a concert in this big old barn with, hay and straw and all kinds of stuff around, this big old barn, which was being heated by this big trash can in the middle with a fire. Well, in the middle of the concert, two guys got into a fight. They were fighting and hitting and rolling around and so on. Apparently, they went into the trash can, knocked it over, spilling fire and embers and burning materials all over the straw and the hay and everything, and the barn caught on fire. And everybody ran out, got out. He got out and realized he had left his guitar in the barn. He ran back into the burning barn, got his guitar, and ran back out again. He found out later that the two men were fighting over a woman named Lucille. So he said he named his guitar Lucille to remind himself never to do a damn fool thing like that again. I have to end this by going back to what I said at the beginning, correcting what I said at the beginning. The thrill is not gone, not as long as the music survives. So R.I.P. B.B. King. And we're taking a break. And here we are back again. I'm going to start with a quick correction. The gentleman who I said was one of Pope Francis's key advisors, who said he was stunned by the complaints he heard about the upcoming document on climate change. The man's name is Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Maradiaga. Not Maradinga, Maradiaga. Apparently I can't even read my own notes, but I just wanted to make that correction. All right, for the rest of the show, this is going to be a little bit different than we usually do. There's going to be no graphics, no eye candy. It's just going to be you and me. While I talk about something that I've just been having some thoughts about. This is going to be kind of rambling. I just have some notes about things. I wanted to make points, but I don't know exactly what I'm going to say. I'm kind of making this up as I go along. So we'll see how this works out. What started this is some of the talk about, we've seen so many incidents in the last, let's just say year, just for that, where young, unarmed black men have been killed by cops who swore that they were in danger of their lives. It's produced anger, it's produced outrage, it's produced demonstrations, protests, and even some riots. And this has happened enough and has gotten enough attention that people have started asking if cops, if police are by their nature racist and brutal. And I got to thinking that there are two issues here. Two separate issues. There's cops and there's racism. And while there's overlap, these are really two separate things. Because you're really just combining and almost conflating two issues. So in thinking about that, I want to start in what may seem an odd way, but it's referring to an incident which in the broad scheme of things has nothing to do with police and may seem very minor in the broad scheme of things. And in fact, it happened 6 years ago in 2009. But you'll see where I'm going with this. It involved a man named Carlton Haywood. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins who was set to travel from Baltimore to New York to give a speech at an important medical conference. But the night before he was to leave, he started to feel a searing pain surging through his arms, spread to his legs. By the time it was time for the train to leave, it felt like his whole body was on fire. By the time he got to New York a few hours later, he could barely make it to the emergency room. He knew what was wrong. He knew what was wrong. He suffers from sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease. It's a genetic condition in which misshapen red blood cells build up in the body. This can cause infections, strokes, and excruciating episodes of pain. He had lived with sickle cell for 39 years. He knew what was going on. He knew what he needed. He knew what had to be done. And he's a bioethicist who had studied sickle cell as part of his professional discipline. So at the ER, he requested a specific set of medications. He knew this is what he needed. The hematologist on duty refused. He basically dismissed him as if, you don't know what you're talking about. Haywood wound up in the hospital for a week and missed his conference. Sickle cell is the most common life-shortening genetic disease in the United States. Over 100,000 people suffer from this. And in his research on sickle cell, again as a bioethicist, Haywood had discovered that treatment such as he received, this kind of insulting, condescending treatment that he had received, was common among sickle cell sufferers. When sickle cell patients ask for certain medications, which they have learned by their own experience are what they need, they're often dismissed. In fact, if they ask for opioids for their pain, they're very often regarded as pill seekers, as people who come into the ER and fake symptoms in order to get pills so they can get high. He also found that sickle cell patients in ERs have longer waits for treatment than people in acute pain from other conditions. All right, something else I'm going to bring up, and it's again, it seems different, but you'll see it's related. It's cystic fibrosis, or CF. This is a respiratory and digestive condition. Like sickle cell, it is genetic. Like sickle cell, it gets worse with age. Like sickle cell, it requires a rather strict daily drug regimen. Like sickle cell, it often results in hospitalization. And like sickle cell, it dramatically shortens a person's expected lifespan. People with cystic fibrosis, their median lifespan is 37. For people with sickle cell, it's about 40 to 45. Despite all those similarities, spending on research, drug development, and education and patient advocacy for cystic fibrosis is 4 times that for sickle cell, even though cystic fibrosis affects only 1/3 as many people. That means per patient spending on cystic fibrosis is 12 times that of sickle cell. Even through the federal government, federal funding through the NIH for research on cystic fibrosis is nearly 4 times per patient what it is on sickle cell. And NIH-funded researchers between 2009 and 2012 published twice as many papers on CF as they did on sickle cell. Somehow, in the attitudes expressed by where we put our resources, we as a society are saying that sickle cell is just less important a condition, and the sufferers of sickle cell are just less important than those who suffer with CF. Why the difference? And why are sickle cell sufferers more likely to be suspected of faking and to spend longer waiting for treatment? Well, I submit to you that one big reason is that 90% of the people who suffer from sickle cell disease are African American, while those who suffer from CF are overwhelmingly white. This kind of difference, this kind of disparity in treatment, disparity in condition, it exists even in the most supposedly liberal areas. For example, Boston. A study several years ago at Boston Hospital showed that physicians presented with hypothetical cases of patients coming to the emergency room with signs of a heart attack, that those physicians consistently proposed treating whites more aggressively, ordering more tests, engaging in more direct intervention than they did with African Americans. Even when you allowed for other factors, including age, physical condition, and prior medical history, that racial difference remained. And again, it's not just medicine. It's not just medicine. For 10 years, the state of Massachusetts, again, has had a program under which judges have been quietly and anonymously rated by the lawyers who appear before them. Well, a few years ago, an evaluation, about 2 or 3 years ago, an evaluation was done of those 10 years of data by 2 Harvard sociologists who were brought in to do exactly that. And the data, they said, revealed a consistent pattern of racial bias against black judges. These same 2 researchers also convened several focus groups of lawyers and judges and said that the pattern that emerged was, quoting, the idea that persons of color do not match the expectations of what a judge should look like. Now, what's important here, and the point I'm really making here, is that these 2 studies, the last 2 studies that I mentioned, the Massachusetts courts and the Boston hospital, in both of those studies, the people who were treating blacks differently than they were treating whites denied that they were doing so. And they were probably being honest. They probably did not realize the differences in the way they were treating people. They did not realize the differences in what they were doing, because that's one of the essences of racism. It's a difference in attitudes and actions based on unspoken, sometimes, often, way too often, even unrecognized assumptions. Racism doesn't exist just in the obvious. It exists in the subtle, in the invisible ways, in the ways that are woven into everyday attitudes. So, are police racist? Of course they are. They are members of and products of a racist society. Now, I don't know if there's any basis to say the cops are any more racist than any other group in society. There's an argument that can be made that the type of person who wants to become a cop is very often a person who values order and discipline and everything being structured, and that such people may be more likely to be racist because they're less likely to challenge the standards of the society that surrounds them. But that's an argument. That's not evidence. So I don't know if there's any real evidence that cops can be said as a group to be any more or less racist than the rest of society, but because we're in a racist society, that really doesn't help a lot. Which brings up the other part, the cops themselves. One of the things that struck me so much about so many of these encounters that we see video of now, and we hear hear the calls and hear the police radios and so on, how often to me these cops sound scared. They sound almost terrified. Back in 1982, a researcher named Dennis Tuller performed a rudimentary series of tests by which he concluded that if an attacker rushed at a cop, that attacker could cover 21 feet before a normal cop could get their gun out and draw their weapon. He published his findings, and what became known as the 21-foot rule became dogma. The idea that if you're a cop and somebody's within 21 feet of you, you are in immediate danger of your life because they could kill you before you could react. This has been taught in police academies. It's been accepted by courts. It's been cited by officers to justify shootings. The cops have been taught how to use force. They have not been taught how to avoid using or having to use force. One result of this is that cops killed more people in the United States in this month of March of this year than the combined police forces of the United Kingdom have killed in the entire last century. The right wing is claiming there's a war on cops because 51 cops were killed in action in last year, which was up from 27 the year before. Well, that figure of the people killed by cops in March of this year was 111. If there is in fact a war going on, it's clear which side is racking up the body count. The point I'm making is that cops have been taught to be scared. They have been taught to be afraid. They have been taught to think that their life is in danger, not just every day, but every second, and not just a general kind of like philosophical awareness or awareness in the back of your mind of the risks in which you're engaged, but you're being taught to have a literal, tangible feeling of danger every single moment. So you take people like that, and because of racism, who in our society is inherently seen as more dangerous, as seen as threatening? Blacks, especially young black males. And at the same time, police know, they know from experience, that they are almost never charged of crimes of this sort. And if they are charged, they're less than half as likely as the general public to get convicted, and if they're convicted, less than half as likely to go to jail. The problem is not that cops are more racist than the rest of society, but they are as racist as the rest of society. They are taught to being afraid, then they're presented with the object of their fears, and of course we're going to see what we've seen. In fact, we've seen this for a long time. We have just refused to actually see it. The problem is not that cops are more racist than any of the rest of us. The problem is it's because they are the ones with the guns, and they are scared, and they know they can get away with it. And that is a very dangerous combination. That's it for me. We're done for this week. There will not be a new show next week. I'm taking a vacation. So I will see you in 2 weeks. In the meantime, you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can, and peace.